we were talking about a thought experiment, and that was imagining you're going to space today and you're going to experience the vacuum of space. So what can we expect to happen? Say we were feeling a little bit too adventurous and we decided we had a jetpack, and we were going to experience the vacuum of space. What kind of physiological effects can we expect to experience? So that's my first thought experiment for you. And then my second thought experiment is, imagine you're going to the moon today and you're the crew physician and you're being asked to pack the crew kit, the medical supplies. So what are you going to pack and how are you going to inform your packing? So to do that, it helps to know what the spaceflight environment entails. So when we talk about space, there's a lot to consider. And so we're going to go through all of these headings briefly, and then we'll talk about how we organize these. So when we talk about going to space and the vacuum of space, so first of all, if we had a jetpack and we could go as far as space, above the 100-kilometer Kármán line where space is arbitrarily designed to, designated to begin, ignoring for a minute the fact that the atmosphere would be too thin for us to support any type of airplane, but say we could generate enough thrust on a jetpack. So then assume that through some physiological miracle, you could actually breathe air that thin and you could make it to the vacuum of space. So will your head actually explode? No, but you will be subjected to temperature extremes. You'll be subjected to a zero oxygen atmosphere. And then the pressure differential, we call it the vacuum of space for a reason, is that the pressure differential is essentially, there's zero pressure in space. And so all the fluids would boil off from your body. So your eyeballs would distend and the fluids would boil off rather quickly. Your eyeballs would freeze. The blood vessels would expand tremendously. You would get this coppery taste on your tongue as the blood vessels, first of all, expanded tremendously, and then you froze. So your head wouldn't necessarily explode, but you would die. So that's why we need spaceships. So that's the first thing there is to know about space. So when we talk about the hazards of space, we talk about all of the various ways in which space can harm us. So first of all, there's radiation. And the further out we go from space, the more of a threat radiation becomes. So the reason that we can survive on Earth is because we have the protection of the Van Allen belts and the magnetosphere, which filters out high energy radiation particles. The two most harmful types of radiation that comes from ionizing energy. So when we talk about space radiation, we talk about trapped particles in the Van Allen belts and the magnetosphere. We talk about solar particle events, solar flares. That's ionizing energy, as well as high energy ionizing energy from galactic cosmic radiation. So we're relatively protected, even at the level of the International Space Station, 400 kilometers above the Earth. But once we go beyond those Van Allen belts, we don't have that protection. And so the estimation is for a round trip journey to Mars, you can experience the equivalent of 0.66 sieverts, which means nothing to you if you don't know anything about radiation. So to put that in context, it's the equivalent of a full body CT scan every 5 to 6 days. So that's the radiation aspect of it. There's also the elements of the vehicle you're in and the launch rocket itself. So there's the acceleration, deceleration loads. There's altered day-night cycles. On the ISS, you're circling the Earth at a rate of 1 revolution every 90 to 93 minutes. So that's 16 sunset cycles per 24-hour period. You're in a confined space, so you have to be a really good teammate, lest you be that guy that's voted off the spaceship. You're relatively protected from the temperature extremes inside the confines of your vehicle, which is really good because otherwise it would be inhabitable. We're talking on the order of 100, at least 100 degrees Celsius differential at the extremes on the day-night side, even at the ISS. There's the risk of decompression sickness. So anytime an astronaut goes on EVA on a spacewalk, say they have to do some maintenance work outside the the International Space Station, there's still a pressure differential between the atmospheric pressure in the ISS versus in the spacesuit. So they actually have to do a pre-breathe protocol to with pure oxygen, as well as using a cycloergometer to perform aerobic exercise to help dissipate the nitrogen that's dissolved in their skin to decrease the risk of in their blood to help decrease the risk of developing decompression sickness and having bubbles come out of solution and lodge in places that are bad. This is a place that's remote and resource limited. So if you break a leg, it's not as easy as going to a hospital. We'll talk about that later. We've talked a little bit about what to expect in the vacuum of space. And then there's everyday risks. You can still run into a sharp edge. You can still cut yourself. You can still experience a dysrhythmia. You can still experience a heart attack. So there's all of that to worry about as well. There's off-gassing from organic compounds. So you have to be aware of, in this confined space, what kind of gases are being released from the environment you're in. And finally, the number one thing that we all think about when we go to space is being in zero G. So let's spend the bulk of our time on that in this section. So when we talk about zero gravity, pretty much every single system is affected, whether we're talking about our bones, our muscles, our cardiovascular system, our fluid levels, and even our neurological system and our immune systems. So taking each system in turn, we see that there is decreased bone density, and that the more time we spend in space, the more bone density we lose, reflecting the disease states on Earth that we might see, like osteopenia and osteoporosis. We see this particularly in weight-bearing bones, so the spine, the pelvis, the femurs, the thigh bone. We see that muscles, having not being loaded with the weight from gravity, tend to atrophy and lose mass. We'll talk about countermeasures for that in a little bit. Even just knowing that here in 1G, every single one of us attending this lecture is feeling gravity in ways that we don't really pay attention to. So even when we're standing, gravity is pulling fluid down to our feet. That doesn't happen in the zero G environment. And so gravity, the fluid actually shifts upwards. And so our hearts interpret this as having an increased fluid load from the baroreceptors. And astronauts tend to actually pee out more and almost enter a sort of dehydrated state in the first few days on station. They eventually adapt to this. The other consequences of fluid shift are that with the fluid being shifted upwards, the astronauts take on what we call a moon face chicken leg appearance. So their legs become skinnier and their faces become puffier. With all of that fluid shifted upwards, astronauts feel like they're congested all the time. So this actually reflects operationally into the food they eat, because imagine you have a cold. Food just doesn't have a taste. So food on station has to be more flavorful, more textured, and more spicy, and savory, so that astronauts will want to eat it. This fluid shift also puts astronauts at risk for development of kidney stones. And so this reflects into screening and selection criteria. So for example, in the last Canadian selection, candidates who made it quite far in the selection were actually screened out for having asymptomatic kidney stones. And then there's a relatively new findings on how this affects the neurologic system, so the central nervous system. And so what we found over the past 12 years or so is the emergence of something called idiopathic increased intracranial pressure, and now more commonly known as SANS, or the Space Adaptation Neuroocular Syndrome. And basically what SANS is what astronauts started to notice, especially in the male astronaut population, is that they were finding vision alterations. And the mechanism is still being elucidated, but this is thought to be due to increased cerebrospinal fluid bathing the brain and not draining as it normally would. And particularly having altered flow around the outflow tracts of the optic nerve that exits the back of the eye and into the brain. And so that local increased pressure, decreased drainage, and possibly increased CSF pressure all contributes to optic or changes in the ocular system, including flattening of the globe, changes in vision, including hyperopia and optic disc edema. Interestingly, we're trying to find models to reflect this on Earth, such as idiopathic increased intracranial pressure. And some things are alike, but some things are not. So we don't see headaches in this population. On Earth, we see the IIP or the IIH pathology preferentially affect young females with a higher BMI. This isn't the case in astronauts. And the surprises keep coming. So we also know that there's certain gender differences. So for example, females are more likely to experience orthostatic hypotension when they get back to Earth. So any astronaut landing on a Soyuz, landing on Earth post-flight, you never see them walking out, standing up, giving the hero's wave. You see them being carried out. And that's because the astronauts are decompensated after spending time in space. Part of that is because, as we talked about, that fluid shift. So the veins in their legs are decompensated. The gravity tends to have all their fluid pull in their legs. And so if they stand up, they would faint. And part of it is the neurovestibular mismatch. So we didn't talk about that on the previous slide, but within the first 72 hours of coming to space, newcomers can expect something called the space adaptation syndrome. And so basically, when we talk about how we balance and how we move through space and how we process where we are in space, it's a coordination between our eyes, our proprioceptors in our fingers, as well as our inner ears, our vestibular system. So now imagine your proprioception is off because you don't have gravity. Your inner ear is very confused. This translates into having a lot of nausea and vomiting. Usually it always resolves by 72 hours in space. And this is why critical activities like spacewalks aren't scheduled within the first week on arrival on station, because imagine how disastrous it would be to throw up in a spacesuit in 0G with the risk of asphyxia or getting that foreign body in the eye. As a bit of space trivia, this is colloquially known as the Garn scale, named after astronaut Garn. He was later became a US senator, but he became probably one of the sickest astronauts ever. So he has the dubious life distinction of having how sick he become in space, named the Garn scale after him. Yeah, Alec, that's a really good question. So there's a really good paper in Nature on SANS that came out 2-3 months ago, and they are also positing that it also has to do with decreased venous drainage as well. So it's impaired lymphatics drainage, venous drainage, ICP drainage, and possibly altered outflow around the optic nerve. Great question. Okay, so coming back to gender differences. So we talked about how females are more prone to orthostatic intolerance. Coming back on Earth, we talked about how males are more prone to the space adaptation neuroocular syndrome. Women having shorter urethras are more prone to UTIs. And then certain things are the same. We don't see any difference in performance or psychological coping, teamwork, anything like that. So moving on. So the other thing that we talk about is what makes a good teammate. So when we talk about selecting the the best candidates to be an astronaut, we want someone who's skilled, can acquire skills across very highly skilled at what they do, but can also spread out and learn skills across many domains. And we also talk about screen in, screen out criteria relating to psychiatric and psychological conditions. So things like psychosis, major depression are screen out criteria. Whereas screening criteria, you want someone who's very team-oriented, mission-focused, very resilient. And so we also have data from extreme environments and previous space flights showing that people who are more resilient tend to do better in this type of austere environment. The term is called salutogenesis, and these are people who rise to the occasion and view a resource-limited environment as a chance to kind of prove themselves and do better. And the research around resilience shows that this type of trait is learned and can be broken down into fundamentals such as breaking monumental tasks down, engaging in positive self-talk and relying on positive social support. engaging in mental rehearsal, practicing the best and the worst case scenarios. Chris Hadfield talks about this in his book, An Astronaut's Guide to Earth, and talks about the power of negative thinking. And then impulse control, so resisting the urge to get frustrated, resisting the urge to give up. There's similar research around coping in austere environments, and it's very similar to the research around coping. So people who engage in planful problem solving, so there's that breaking things down, as well as mental rehearsal, seeking social support, there's that positive social support networks, enduring harsh conditions, there's that impulse control, emphasizing the positive, and relying on luck. So it's interesting to note that, you know, we once thought that this was the right stuff, but there's actually research in personality inventories. And when they're going through the screening, in addition to being amongst the healthiest candidates out there, astronauts also have to go through extensive personality batteries. I've heard anecdotally that the NASA astronauts have to go through the 600 question personality battery. So this was, here's some more resources around the space adaptation neuroocular syndrome. I haven't included the Nature reference, but it is quite a good paper. I encourage you to look it up. And the surprises keep coming with spaceflight. So, you know, after decades, you'd think that we'd have it all figured out and have better ways of engaging in countermeasures. But as late as the last quarter of 2019, we had data from the ISS wherein upon routine ultrasound testing, where astronauts were using handheld ultrasound to image the jugular veins, they found a large blood clot there. So that's yet another question that's become at the forefront of operational space medicine. Does being in space predispose us to a prothrombotic state? So for those of you who are in medicine, you may have heard of the Berghaus triad of hypercoagulability, so stasis, injury, endothelial damage. So there's definitely the stasis part in medicine. So then the question becomes, well, how much of a risk is this? Is this always happening? We just picked it up? Was this just a one-off? So these are considerations going forward. So what we know in this case is they happen to have, I think it was low molecular weight heparin on station, and they treated the patient with the astronaut with that, and then stopped it several days before returning to Earth. And by the time the patient was reimaged on Earth, the clot had dissipated. We have more data from that keeps coming out. So this was the NASA twin study. So you may know Scott and Mark Kelly. They're both astronauts. They're identical twins. One is now a senator in Arizona, I think. And so what they did was one of them, Commander Kelly, spent a year in space. And the other one was retired from the astronaut corps. And this is probably one of the most comprehensive papers and collaborative papers to date. And so they looked at everything from the molecular genetics, they looked at methylation on DNA, they looked at biochemistry, proteomics, metabolomics, telomeres, and even performance and cognition. And so in some cases, the results were surprising. They found telomere lengthening on the twin who was in space. And so the thinking prior to this is telomere shortening results in quicker aging. And they also found at the macro level evidence of cognitive slowing when it came to performance. And so this was, if you're interested, you can look Google NASA twin study in Science. It's quite a fascinating, extensive paper. So this is all a very long-winded way of saying, if you remember nothing else from the impacts of the spaceflight environment, it's that space is trying to kill you. But obviously we're sending humans to space and we're doing so successfully. So how are we doing that? So before we get to that, let's just take a minute to recap. This is all of the data from low Earth orbit to date. So where do we go next? So let's focus on the operational aspect of space medicine first. So it's not just about the patient, it's also the human in the giant loop. And so it's not just about focusing on one astronaut and the hazards of the spaceflight environment. It's also focusing on that human in the context of the mission, the tasks, the objectives that they achieve, the environment, their integration with the vehicle, the ECLIS, or Enclosed Loop Life Support System. And then also looking at how we can engage in human factors engineering to optimize some of these hazards, for example, the launch vehicle, as well as what needs to be mitigated in terms of clinical conditions versus what just needs to be monitored. So how do we do that? So this is the NASA Human Research Program risk matrix. And so the way that NASA addresses risk, so first of all, it starts at selection. So we kind of alluded to this briefly. So they want the healthiest of the healthy. So in one sense, to be an astronaut is a bit of a genetic lottery. You can be the best candidate ever, but if you have asymptomatic kidney stones, you're a no-go. If you have an undetected heart condition, you're a no-go. That also extends to the psychological, psychiatric part. So it's really interesting to see, some of you may have seen that mission announcement from Axiom. They're a private company sending spaceflight participants, private citizens, to the International Space Station. This has been done before. Guy Laliberté, the French-Canadian founder of Cirque du Soleil, previously went up to the International Space Station. So we know that the private astronauts, the screening is far less, is more lenient. So you can have things that would be select out criteria for governmental astronauts are not necessarily so for the private sector. How else do we mitigate risk? So in addition to selection, it starts with pre-flight countermeasures, continues with in-flight countermeasures, and continues with post-flight rehab. So let's look at, for example, one of the risks we identified, that's muscle atrophy and bone density loss. And so pre-flight, astronauts are put on a full individualized exercise program. This continues in flight. And so for exercise regimens on station, there's the cycle ergometer, as well as the treadmill, as well as the advanced resistive exercise device, the AREDS machine. So that's a weight machine that can works on resistive hydraulics that allows the astronaut to engage in weight-bearing activities like squats, weightlifting, deadlifts, that kind of thing. And so each astronaut for 6 days a week has to engage in 2 to 2.5 hours of combined cardiovascular and resistive exercise. It comes down to nutrition. So we talked a little bit about this earlier. When we talk about nutrition, there's the criteria that has to be lightweight, have a long shelf life. So things like oranges are a rarity. They're a delicacy on the space station. Astronauts might get it sent up for Thanksgiving or Christmas. It has to be flavorful. It has to be something the astronaut will need, eat, and then it will also have to reflect the increased nutritional demands of being on station. Coming back to the risk matrix. So just to quickly summarize, when we talk about risks of things that can happen in space, we look at what is the likelihood of something happening versus the consequence of it happening. And so if something is low risk, very unlikely to happen, we don't worry about it. It doesn't need to be part of the mission plan, versus if something is high risk and high consequence if it does occur, then we need to mitigate it. So a urinary tract infection, Apollo 13, Fred Hayes had urosepsis. So that is mission critical, and it can occur. There's precedent for that. So then we need to have antibiotics on station, as well as possibly IV fluid on station to mitigate that. In addition to this, there's pre-flight quarantine measures that are now extended in the era of COVID, as you can imagine. And then, of course, there's protocols for dealing with medical issues in space. So there's a crew medical officer on the ISS. They have 40 hours of training, and there's an onboard medical supplies, including medical gear, medications, protocols. If there's even a protocol for doing CPR in space in 0G. Sounds like most of the problems have to do with, I am glad you asked, Alec. Alec, hold on to that question. Yes, we will get to that, but the short answer is yes. Okay, so we talked about this extensively. In addition, the only thing I'll add is that in terms of operational space medicine protocols, is that there are also private weekly one-on-one meetings with the flight surgeon. The astronauts' health data, just like any patient on Earth, is protected quite extensively. And then there's also bi-weekly meetings, so every 2 weeks, with the crew psychologist. So they take health and mental wellness very seriously. Okay. So what does it look like to be a flight surgeon? Very, very multidisciplinary. You can have everything from general practitioners, aerospace and aviation specialists. One of the NASA flight surgeons is a urologist. One of the ESA flight surgeons is a former neurosurgeon. And then you also want to liaise with all of the service, all of your interdisciplinary services. So occupational health, exercise physiologists, pharmacologists, psychologists, occupational health. Okay, so that's the human side of it. So how do we use computer modeling to help us identify and mitigate risk? So this is the NASA Integrated Medical Model, the IMM. And basically how this works is it extrapolates on data from decades of human spaceflight, and then we input our specific mission profile. So assuming, say for example, we wanted to model what kit content and quantity we would need based on extrapolating from what's on the ISS already. And we input the number of crew, the duration of the mission, as well as our acceptable levels of loss of crew and loss of mission. What probabilities are we willing to accept? And then based on those inputs and outputs, we model what that kit would look like. So that's helpful in one extent, but it's also quite singular. It's not very multidimensional because it only accounts for occurrences at X point in time during the mission. Because if you break a leg at the very beginning of a mission on the way to Mars, maybe 30 minutes out from Earth, it's going to impact what you do with your mission versus if you impact it, you know, at the end of a mission as you're about to take off on the surface of Mars. So then comes in the MedPrat, and that stands for the Medical Extensible Dynamic Probability Risk Assessment Tool, which is why we call it the MedPrat. It's much easier to say. So this is an extrapolation probabilistic modeling tool based on Bayesian networks, and it allows for us to input multiple events at different times in a mission timeline to ultimately generate probabilities of different outcomes. So this is an example of another tool that we use to help predict different events and outcomes, and also how these may be mitigated with different countermeasures. Okay, so then the next thing we need to prepare for is, well, what are we planning for? Like, you know, is it reasonable to prepare to do a C-section in space? Well, no, because we plan for that. You know, we provide, there's contraception, there's birth control, there's pregnancy tests on the ISS. And also then we have decades of data from human spaceflight. And so then what are we planning for? This is the NASA Top 100, the Exploration Medical Capability. This is a group out of Johnson Space Center that's created a list of top 100 most likely things we're going to deal with in space. So it's everything from the terrifying cardiac arrest in space to something annoying like a headache, to something equally terrifying but not life-threatening like diarrhea in space. So now we know that what we're planning for. The next question is, how do we pack for that? So you're probably already thinking about this. The wheels in your brain are turning. Here are examples of what some of the medical kits on the ISS look like. So you can see they're very compartmentalized, very modular, very organized. They have examples of all of their contents within them. So taking a pause here, we've talked about space medicine to date. We've talked about the challenges to date, but this is all just governmental space agencies in low Earth orbit. So what happens when we talk about going beyond low Earth orbit? And it's not just a theoretical question, because for those of you who follow space news and space timelines quite closely, we know that we're going to the moon and beyond. We know with the current NASA roadmap, the plan is to proceed with Lunar Gateway, to have that station operational within the next few years, have it crewed for 3 months at a time, use it for Earth observation, lunar observation, exploration, science, as well as astronomy. Beyond Lunar Gateway, that's a space station circling in lunar orbit. We plan to have boots on the ground in the next several years with the Artemis mission, with the return of the next man and the first woman on the moon. And the plan is to have permanent lunar surface operations by the end of this decade. The other point of going to the moon is to use it as a test bed for going to Mars and beyond. So these aren't just theoretical questions. So then the question becomes, how do we need to organize our thinking now, knowing that we're going to the moon and Mars, and then also knowing that it's not just NASA, it's not just the Canadian Space Agency, but it's the private sector as well. You know, Elon Musk has famously said that he wants to have colonies of humans on Mars. He wants to have settlements of people on Mars. So let's organize our thinking, because we've talked a lot about the hazards of the space flight, human hazards of space flight. Okay, so I want you to take a close look at this slide, because we've talked about a lot of things, but at the end of the day, every single one of these hazards we talked about can be organized into one of 5 key categories. Okay, so we talked about the altered gravity environment. So we talked about the effects of microgravity. We know that we are going to also experience other gravity environments. So on the moon, we experience 17% of the Earth's gravity and 33% on Mars. So if you weigh 100 pounds on Earth, you weigh 17 pounds on the moon, 33 pounds on Earth. We talk about the distance from Earth, and that becomes relevant because the farther we go, well, the speed of light can only travel so fast. So by the time you get to the moon, you're dealing with a 2.4 second time delay. So it's a little bit annoying, but not impossible to have a near real-time communication with Earth. By the time you get to Mars, depending on the conjunction of the 2 planets, you're dealing with either a 6 to 46 minute time delay round trip. So imagine that you are on Mars. Your crew position is the one who's been incapacitated, and they are actively dying, like they're in asystole, they're in cardiac arrest. You do not have time to radio mission control and the flight surgeon back on Earth for help. So this comes back into, this will shape the next part of the lecture when we talk about forward-facing problems. We talked about the radiation problem and how we can be exposed to increased amounts of radiation beyond the Van Allen belts. We talked about isolation and confinement. So now look at the mission profile for a place like Mars. 6 to 9 months to get there, 6 to 9 months to get back. So it doesn't make sense to go there for travel 9 months each way and then have a month-long mission profile. Odds are if you're going to Mars, you're going there for 18 months or more at a time. So it's going to be a mission profile on the order of years, not months. And then there's everything else we haven't talked about yet. There's hostile environments. So there's the 14 day-night cycle on the moon. Your sleep cycle is going to be thrown off. There's the lunar regolith, that fine dust that we know from all of the Apollo missions has caused tremendous problems with skin irritation, respiratory irritation, even clogging up the wrist joints in the Apollo era suits. If you're interested, you can Google biomedical lessons from Apollo and learn more. There's hundreds of pages of documentation on it. So to reiterate, space is trying to kill you, okay? So the other way we organize all of these risks, this is the NASA Human Research Roadmap. And so the top 5 list of, or the list of 5 hazards of spaceflight comes from the same group, from the exploration medical capability. But here's all of the other things that can go wrong. Here's the nitty gritty. It's everything from crew dynamics. It's everything from how we interface, how the crew interfaces with their computers and their equipment. It's everything from skills deterioration on the way to Mars. Imagine you learned as the crew medical officer how to insert an IV on Earth and didn't practice that skill until 9 months later on Mars. Suddenly you're going to be out of practice and using your patient as a pincushion. So you need to figure out a way to keep up your skills practice. And the list goes on and on. It includes everything from dust to radiation to risk of injury during EVA. So the final principle I want you to be aware of is, how do we pack for space? We talked about what we're packing for. We talked about models we can use to inform our packing. We talked about the data from spaceflight, but what are our constraints? NASA calls this the backpacking principle. And just think about if you're going on a hike. Everything you bring with you when you're going on a hike comes at the expense of something else because you're limited with space. I like to call this the ELON principle because it's infinite cosmic power to get to space. It's itty bitty living space. To summarize, your constraints come down to needing something that is low volume, low cost, low mass, has a long shelf life, is easy to use, doesn't cost a lot, and is ideally radiation resistant. So you have these constraints. The other question to ask is, what is our gold standard when it comes to packing for space? Yeah, we like to treat things, but ideally, the gold standard is to be able to meet the standard of care that we would see on Earth. And I like to ask them, on taking one step further, well, what if we could not just meet that standard? What if we could surpass it? So how do we do that? Well, that's what you're in this class for, to talk about technology. So let's talk about that. What technologies can we use to set ourselves up for success on the moon and beyond? For that, I like to look at ideas from science fiction, because going back to this last slide, what would be ideal, what would solve all of our problems, assuming we had no constraints, would just be to bring Earth with us. Imagine if we could terraform Mars, then all of a sudden we solve the gravity problem, the radiation problem, the atmosphere problem, and even the resource limitation problem. We can't do that yet, but there are a lot of elements that we can borrow from science fiction to get there. So imagine that we could overcome the deleterious effects of altered gravity environments with a rotating artificial gravity space station. So then you wouldn't have to worry about the space adaptation neuroocular syndrome. You wouldn't have to worry about the fluid shift, the bone density loss, the muscle atrophy. Say you didn't do that. Say you got your astronauts to Mars and they were survived but horribly decompensated. Well, you still want them to be able to still carry out meaningful work. So what if you provided them with an exoskeleton so they didn't have to worry about how strong or decompensated they were? When it comes to skills deterioration, how do you mitigate that while respecting your principles of packing for space? What if you could engineer a holodeck or the Matrix where you could upload skills to your brain or at least practice them in a virtual world? And what if we just said, all of that's too much work, why don't we just send holograms or avatars to space? So some of these ideas aren't as sci-fi as you think. So this is a paper that's one of my favorites. I highly encourage you to look it up. This is the MIT Technology Review from 2017. It's an article called Engineering the Perfect Astronaut. For those of you who were around during the 90s, this is obviously a movie called Gattaca, and so they talk about this futuristic dystopian world in which there's these classes of genetically enhanced humans who are considered superior versus the ones who are not. And it's not as sci-fi as we think. So this article talks about very future looking themes like splicing in elephant genes someday to the human genome. And right now they're starting with splicing that into the genes of a banana. And it's not to turn astronauts into a generation of elephant people, but it's because elephants don't get cancer. Why is that? It's because elephants have 4 copies of the P57 oncogene, that's a cancer editing gene, while humans have only 2. So imagine that you mitigated the radiation risk of increased cancer by just having more P57 oncogenes. This answer is even closer than we think. So here are results from the September 2020, so just a few months ago. This is the Rodent Research 19 experiment, colloquially called the Mighty Mouse experiment. So in this experiment, they took 2 sets of mice, genetically engineered mice, the jacked up little mouse that you see here on the left that has all of this extra muscle mass, as well as the normal mice. Now they did 2 interventions. So they had one group, so both mice were flown, and then there were controls on the ground of each type of mouse. And then the intervention was including the ACVR2B knockout gene. And that gene is implicated in muscle breakdown. So when they introduced a blockade of this pathway, they found that the jacked up mice, even when they were flown, when they had this knockout, they not only had decreased bone density and muscle mass loss, in some cases, they even increased bone density. So NASA is literally engineering Mighty Mouse. So imagine that you could either genetically select for astronauts who naturally had more muscle mass, or you could introduce a blockade that prevented them from losing muscle mass and bone density. So I alluded a little bit to the Earth applications of what we're learning from space. If we have time, we'll get into this at the very end. But even with this experiment alone, we're already seeing implications for possibly treating osteopenic and osteoporotic states, as well as neuromuscular and neurodegenerative diseases like muscular dystrophy. What else can we learn from science fiction? So Alec, this is where your question comes into play. I have to disclose I am the medical director of research with this company. This is a screenshot from Orbital Assembly Corporation. So we are proposing to put the world's first commercial rotating artificial gravity space station in space. So this will start with prototypes of obviously smaller 60-meter prototypes, but eventually hoping to have large-scale commercial space stations in which we can either rotate at lunar or Martian gravity to mitigate some of these deleterious effects. So the question then becomes, well, at what rate are you going to rotate this? What level of gravity are you going to accept? And is it going to be continuously rotating, or is it going to be for periods at a time? So this, getting ahead a few slides, is actually one of the unknowns that we have to answer in our roadmap going forward. So there's a lot of unknowns that we'll end off the hour with, but this is one of them. What is the gravity prescription? How much gravity for what duration at what point in time do we need to mitigate all of these effects we talked about? Because every single one of us, all 7 billion of us here on Earth, every protozoan, every amoeba, every orangutan has the luxury of having evolved in 1G. Now we have decades of spaceflight from 0G. We just don't have the in-between. We have some research from bioreactors and rotating arm centrifuges, but we need more. There's a really good paper in Nature in 2017 called Artificial Gravity that lays out the international roadmap put together by all the space agencies, the questions they want to answer, and some of them are what I just discussed. Borrowing from science fiction, this is really forward thinking, but basically, if you can imagine it, someone is working on it. So what about human hibernation to save on our resource utilization costs when it comes to life support, atmosphere, water? And so ESA ran a study looking at human hibernation and calculated that they could get away with 1/3 less volume costs on the way to Mars, and simply wake up the astronauts several weeks ahead of arrival to save on mission resupply costs. The Alaskan Arctic Biology Institute out of Alaska is also looking at models of hibernation in, I think, ground squirrels, and seeing how they can extrapolate that to other species, so non-hibernating species. So the advantage is your metabolic rate decreases by 99% in hibernation. So they've experimented on rats so far. They've got them to hibernate. The downside is they're experiencing severe sepsis because of gut ischemia and perforation. There's a little problem there that needs to be solved before I can generalize this to humans. All right, so plugging right on along in the last 20 minutes here. So how else can you hack the system? How else can you overcome the challenges of spaceflight? Well, what if we just simply didn't have to spend 9 months in space on the way to Mars? We know that a lot of data with the deleterious effects, for example, the space adaptation neuroocular syndrome, seems to come into play in long duration spaceflight, defined as 30 days or more. So this is the Vasimir plasma engine. It proposes to cut down the travel time to Mars to 39 days. That's excellent, because now you're suddenly severely limiting the time you spend in 0G and very much mitigating the risk of SANS. Okay, so the summary is, to be able to get to space, to be able to get to Mars and not just survive, but thrive there, we're going to have to pull a Mark Watney and science the space out of this with a little bit of MacGyvering as well. So what else can we look at? I talked a little bit about this last time. So this is the work I do with Luxonic Technologies, and we talked about how this may apply to space. So we're currently developing a sepsis module for the Canadian Space Agency. And the reason we're doing that is because exactly of some of the risks and design constraints that we talked about earlier. We talked about the NASA Human Research Roadmap of the human research risk of skills degradation. So I talked to you about the example of the IV and not wanting to use my patient as a human pincushion. So what if you could practice your skills in VR on the way to Mars for skills maintenance? This also overcomes the design constraints of actually needing to have practice mannequins because you're able to practice this in VR, so you're able to save on that mass volume, those mass and volume costs. VR is used extensively in astronaut training. It's used for rover simulation. It's used for robotics training. It's used for in multiple avenues in the astronaut training pathway. Okay, so what about other ideas from science fiction? So how might we employ machine learning and AI? Ideally, we don't want to engineer a HAL 9000, but maybe a friendlier version that's maybe a little bit more chipper like TARS. And when we talk about applications for space medicine specifically, we talk about how do we apply machine learning for diagnostics and treatment. And we talked about this last time. As a single physician, you're never going to know everything. You just need to know where to find that data and how to make the best possible decisions. So what if you had a very puzzling case or the diagnosis wasn't clear? What if you could have a AI that could also be able to help guide that diagnostic decision-making based on best practices, probabilities, outcomes, as well as constraints? We talked a little bit about genetic engineering with the Gattaca and Mighty Mouse examples. So another example can be CRISPR. How can we use gene synthesis to help make astronauts more resilient in these harsh environments? Of course, with this, we have to discuss the ethics of doing this. And, you know, there's two sides to this argument. And the one is the slippery slope of creating a divide and genetically augmenting humans. On the other side is the argument that if you're willingly and knowingly sending astronauts into a high-risk environment in which they're going to suffer deleterious effects, do you have a moral and ethical duty to enhance them, to set them up for success and mitigate any risk? We talked a little bit about the 6th P of medicine last class, and that was point of care. So point of care diagnostics, having a handheld blood sampling, blood analyzer machine that can tell you your electrolytes, your creatinine, your kidney, liver function immediately and in a way that's lightweight and portable. So these are some of the technologies we're looking at in terms of precision medicine when it comes to space medicine. But this is just the beginning. So we have about 20 minutes left. I did want to talk about a little bit about how we prepare on Earth for space. And so what do we learn from analog environments? This is a lot of where my experience comes in. So when we talk about analog environments, what exactly is that? Well, it's an environment that is in some way analogous to the spaceflight environment that replicates some form of space, whether it's zero-G, whether it's isolation confinement, whether it's resource limitedness. So I'm going to take you through 4 such environments right now, and we can talk more about it at the end if you have questions. So altered gravity, that's one of the obvious ones. So there's obviously zero-G. How do we replicate that on Earth? There's drop towers if you want to replicate seconds of gravity at a time. There's also what we know as the vomit comet, parabolic flight. So this is an example. I've run campaigns with the International Institute of Astronautical Sciences for the past 5 years for the National Research Council in Ottawa. And basically you generate zero-G by flying in a parabola. You're not going even as high as a commercial jetliner. We're flying at 17,000 feet. And basically you're going to 2G pull, and then you're falling at the same rate of the plane for about 20 to 30 seconds at a time, and then you're pulling out at 2G. So it's just like when you're in an elevator and then you drop for a second, you can kind of feel your stomach come up for a sec because you're weightless for a second because you're falling at the same rate as the elevator. So what can you test in zero-G for that amount of time? So what we've been doing is we've been working with a commercial spacesuit company called Final Frontier Design. This is an IVA or intervehicular activity spacesuit. So think of it as a second life support system inside your spacecraft in case the life support system fails. So over the years, we've been testing basically the range of motion, fine and gross motor movement. We've been testing the capability and functionality with the visor down and the suit pressurized. And we've been also testing other payloads as well, looking at fluid dynamics. We've been looking at all manner of payloads. Basically, you can actually test quite a lot when it comes to 20 seconds of microgravity. But that's not the only type of altered gravity environment. Remember that we talked about the 1/3 gravity environment of Mars and the 1/6 gravity environment of the Moon. So this is an example of another type of altered gravity environment. So this is a gravity offset harness. So in this harness, I'm strapped in, and basically you can set how much you want to offload your weight. So in this scenario, we tested lunar, Martian, and zero gravity. So in this scenario, I'm testing on EVA, or extravehicular activity spacesuit. This is the kind you would see on a spacewalk during Apollo missions or outside the ISS. In addition to the protective capabilities an IVA spacesuit would provide, it also includes extra thermal protection against that harsh environment and radiation protection. So in this case, I'm completely offloaded. We're simulating zero G. I'm simulating work on an ISS panel, and we're testing the fine and gross motor movement in that suit. We have the, and we're basically testing how well we can maneuver in that suit. This was at the Canadian Space Agency in the High Bay in late 2019. And that brings us to centrifuges. So this is an example of another altered gravity environment. This is at the NASTAR centrifuge facility in Philadelphia in 2016. And basically, we were looking at how flight profiles that suborbital providers like Virgin Galactic would affect anyone. So we talked about right now being a governmental astronaut as being a bit of a having won a bit of a genetic lottery. But we know that when we talk about commercial spaceflight participants, they don't have to meet that stringent criteria. So in this study, they actually looked at all manner of participants from age 18 to 89, type 1 diabetics, COPDers, people with congenital heart defects that were later repaired. And the data from this is quite promising. So even these hyper G profiles with as much as 4GX, so that's 4G in the front to back, 6G in the front to back direction, they found that actually everyone did quite well, and that the most common reason that someone would be discluded would be usually due to anxiety, not following directions, or safety violations. Okay, water analogs. What can we learn from being in the water? So in post-flight, in post-landing scenarios, you also want to know how your spacesuit would react. So in these cases, we tested emergency egress scenarios, either off a mock Orion capsule that you can see behind my right shoulder there, or off a parachute harness into an ocean scenario. And basically, we wanted to see how how the suit would react in the water. And so basically, in one scenario, either scenario, you would either egress into the water, pull the seals on your suit so water couldn't get in, deploy your portable flotation devices, swim over to that raft over my left shoulder, and then climb in. And this feedback said, okay, what needs to change? What worked well? We found that the portable flotation devices were too bulky, for example. I found it the hard way that you really, really, really need to make sure those seals are quite tight. Otherwise, you are taking on a lot of water in your suit, and it becomes really hard to climb up that rope ladder. Other water analogs. This is from the Neptune Aquanautics mission that myself and my team did in late 2019. Like everything else in the space and exploration world, this is an acronym standing for Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration. So for 5 days, we lived in the Jules Undersea Lodge at 20 feet underwater, and we performed studies looking at physiological parameters, including cortisol, vital signs, heart rate variability. We performed sleep and psychology studies, and also did several technology demonstrations, including the Luxonic virtual radiology suite that I showed you a few slides ago. And on the slide. So, and for those of you who very much follow NASA and the space world, you may have heard of NEMO. So this is the NASA Extreme Operations Mission, NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations Facility. This is also known as Aquarius Reef Base. This is only 13 miles down the road from Jules Undersea Lodge, but it sits at 60 feet underwater. I happened to go there to do my dive medical technician training. So we did not stay there at pressure. We stayed there at surface pressure. Why does this matter? Because if you're staying there on an 8 to 16 day rotation, once you're at saturation, when you're breathing the ambient pressure that you would at 60 feet for more than 24 hours, you're in saturation. That means any bubbles in your blood will have dissolved, and that you have to decompress at a controlled rate, because if you don't, then you risk coming up too quickly and having the bubbles coming out of your blood too quickly and lodge in places that are bad, like your joints, your lungs, your brain, causing, in the worst case scenario, seizures, coma, and death. How long does it take to decompress? 15 hours and 47 minutes. How long does it take to emergency evacuate from the ISS? Hours, minimum 3.5 hours. So you can actually get to definitive medical care more quickly from the International Space Station than you can from the Aquarius Reef Base. So this is an excellent analog for simulating crew operations as well as being remote and isolated. Speaking of isolated, this is an example of an analog habitat. So they're cropping up all over the place now. This is MDRS, the Mars Desert Research Station. I've rotated there twice. Once as crew medical officer, once as commander. There's places like Lunaris in Poland, High Seas in Hawaii, and basically these are simulated habitats, either lunar or Martian, that allow a crew to live in isolation and confinement and live exactly like they would on Mars. If you're going outside, you're suiting up because to not do so would kill you. And you're also bringing your own studies with you. There's myriad examples. I haven't included all of them because this is actually the lecture unto itself. But here you can see, like, it almost looks like a Martian train. You can do a lot on the EVA, including exploration and geology. And finally, resource limited environments. It's kind of a blurry line, as you can see, because a lot of the previous examples fall into this. This is an example of a resource limited environment. Obviously, we're quite close to civilization, as evidenced by the house behind me, but this is a shot from my operational space medicine course with the IIAS. And basically, we're teaching course participants to be a medical MacGyver. How do you perform principles of medical assessment, triage, and treatment when you don't have the perks of being near a major healthcare facility? And so this is exactly what we teach them is, you know, you're on an EVA on Mars, someone breaks an ankle, how do you deal with that? And this is the kind of MacGyverish resource limited thinking you want your crew to be able to manage when you are away from Earth, when you're away from definitive medical care. I put this slide in here because also it's not just being on Mars, but it's also we see a lot of resource limited environments, even living and working in rural settings. So I do a lot of rural ER. The most remote place that I've worked in while still being in Alberta required an 8-hour drive to High Level or a 2-hour flight, then an hour drive to Fort Vermilion, then a chartered flight to Garden River, which is a reserve even more north than that. They have doctors maybe twice a week. If you're getting blood samples on your patients, you have to bring the blood samples back with you to deliver to the hospital in Fort Vermilion. So we actually learn a lot about resource limited medicine and how that informs space by working rurally and vice versa. We actually also can make remote care better on Earth using lessons learned from Earth. And David Saint-Jacques, the latest Canadian to go up to the ISS in 2018, was a remote Arctic physician, general practitioner before he ever went to space. Okay, finally, lunar analogs. So again, a lot of overlap here. There's examples of lunar analogs in some of the habitats, Lunaris in Poland, High Seas in Hawaii. But this is a shot of us at Cinder Lake. We did a planetary geology course through the IIAS and Project Possum in 2019. And basically in this course, we were challenged to learn about principles of planetary geology, design geologic tools based on lessons learned and issues encountered during the Apollo era, and then test them out. And so Cinder Lake has significance, and this is the San Francisco volcanic flats. This entire scene is relevant because this is where the Apollo astronauts and the NASA astronaut candidates train for planetary geology, because there's actually a lot of findings. This is a former lava bed. And then Cinder Lake is where the Apollo astronauts trained, and you can even find videos of them testing out their jetpacks. They formed craters with explosives to simulate what the moon's surface would look like. Okay, bringing it back home. So we've talked about the immediate term and what we need to plan for. What about the further questions that we still need to answer? Okay, so we already addressed this one. We still need to figure out what the gravity prescription is. I talked about that Nature paper of artificial gravity, but briefly the big five are: what dose of gravity do we need? Is lunar gravity enough? That's great. If that's the case, that's great. We're set up for Mars. If not, we need to figure something else out. What duration of gravity do we need? How do we react in Mars gravity? What are negative effects of being subjected to artificial gravity in a rotating space station? Because now you're exposed to centrifugal force and you can experience nefarious effects from the Coriolis effect. What was the last one? Oh yeah, validation in space. So we can have all the theory we want about how rotating space stations will work. We need to validate them though. Okay. The radiation problem. So we talked about the challenges of needing to have low mass solutions for the moon and Mars. So there's some space habitat specialists that say that, well, no matter what material you use, it's not going to be thick enough. You need meters of protection. And if that's the case, you need to be thinking about underground habitats to protect humans on the moon and Mars, because that will afford you the level of protection that you need. We also need to start thinking about how our medical capabilities will change going forward, because now the activity that we're doing is different. Now we have a very real risk of a hazardous environment, not just from the dust, but what if the moon is quite steep. It has large craters and large rock formations. What if you slip and fall and crack your visor? What if you get a concussion? What if you break a bone? How is that going to inform your medical protocols? What do you need to bring with you extra now? And how does your medical training need to change in addition to that? Because what if your crew physician is the one that's incapacitated? Is it simply enough to have 40 hours of crew medical training going forward? If we're talking about creating permanent settlements on the moon and beyond, then how do we create the permanent off-world capabilities? And what designs do we use to form that? So this is my personal opinion. I think that we need to go in a stepwise fashion. I think we need to start with both the immediate first aid triage medical officer, and then eventually build up increasingly advanced life support protocols, ending with the surgical and ICU capabilities, and then finally building in the preventative primary care things that we have on Earth, like things you wouldn't normally think about, like endoscopy, for example. What models do we use to inform our off-world medical capabilities? I would suggest that both refugee camps as well as medical field offices that like we would see in the military, like you would see on a deployment in Afghanistan, can offer us a lot in terms of informing how we build up our capabilities. Knowing the constraints of packing for Mars. What will a trauma bay look like? How will we have medical monitors with us? I suspect not, because that's an extra cost. What if we just had a screen built into the wall? How do we train the next generation of the doctors for Mars? In addition to creating specialties for aviation and aerospace medicine, will we be designating specialties in moon and Mars medicine? How do we train for that? How do we test that? And finally, in the era of COVID, of course, we can't get away without asking, how do we handle the first moondemic? There's some excellent articles out there on how quarantine protocols have been prolonged and changed in the era of COVID. So astronauts are quarantining for longer pre-flight. And even the payloads that are going with them, even the payload handling facilities, even those staff have to quarantine, have to self-isolate in order to handle those payloads, knowing they're going to the astronauts. Say COVID hits the moon, what do those protocols look like for care there? Do we enact social distancing protocols of 36 feet? Because now that we're in 1/6 gravity, 6 feet is extended to 36 feet. We talked about wanting to maintain the standard of care, if not surpass it in space. Well, then how do we enforce universal guidelines? Do we evolve from beyond the World Health Organization to having a galactic health organization? How do we govern that? And then finally, if we're serious about enacting things like settlements on Mars, well, settlements implicates intergenerational humans. So that implies breeding and procreating off-world. That's a whole barrel of worms. How do we not just conceive, but how do we develop? How do we give birth? How do those kids grow up in an altered gravity environment? I bring these up because these are some of my other areas of expertise. I've written book chapters on both psychosocial resilience as well as reproduction in space and long duration spaceflight. So these are things that keep me up at night. All right, so I'm not going to belabor reproduction on off-world anymore. I'm happy to talk about it, but I do want to bring it home and then spend some time with discussion. So the final question I want to ask you is, once we've gone to Mars, once we've figured out this whole medical issue, where do we go to next? So the other thing we talked about is commercial spaceflight. And the other question is, if we're serious about making space more accessible for just governmental astronauts, what kind of guidelines do we need? You know, on a spectrum of commercial air travel, where we don't really screen anyone, to governmental astronauts in orbital flight, where we rigorously screen them, how do we change our guidelines for commercial suborbital and orbital spaceflight? And this isn't simply a rhetorical question. Companies like Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, SpaceX are seriously proposing to send everyone and their grandmother to both low Earth orbit and to suborbital spaceflight. I also bring this up because I've researched in this area and worked on a lit review in this area. So I could talk about so many more things, but basically there's a lot to consider when it comes to spaceflight. There's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of frameworks to work within. And the good news is there's no lack of opportunity. Every single bodily system is affected when it comes to spaceflight. There's a lot of models we have on Earth for preparing ourselves for human spaceflight. And we have a lot of work cut out for us. So if you're interested in this field, there's a lot of benefit that we can derive both for the space world and from spaceflight. So I'm going to end it there and turn it over to you for discussion and questions. I'm just going to get to that last slide here. And here's some resources if you're interested. I've a lot of what I've alluded to and a lot of what I haven't alluded to. Here's some things to fuel your imagination and interest, both in space, extreme, and dive medicine. So bottom line is, we need you. All right, over to you guys. Questions, comments, concerns? I'm going to stop the share now.
Hey, I had one question for you.
Yes.
So I know the internet has lots of different opinions on this,
yeah.
But in your opinion, what is the best medical specialty for space medicine?
For what in particular? Like to be a flight surgeon, to go to space, to go to Mars, to go
to study space medicine. Let's say to be an astronaut.
Okay, so there's a couple of answers to that. So to just study space medicine, to get a designation in aerospace and aviation. We've seen internal medicine. I've seen everything from internal medicine to neurosurgery to psychiatry to urology. As long as you're a good candidate, you can be a flight surgeon. This is to work on console at a space agency. If you're interested and you simply love the field, in Canada, really the only way to get that official designation is through the military, but now the Royal College has a 6-month competency in aerospace and aviation that you can get. You have to be 2 years into practice to be eligible. I'm not 2 years into practice, but that's next on my list. And if you're simply interested, you can do what I've done. Just get your feet wet. Just go do it. To be an astronaut, this is based on opinion, and what I saw in the 2016 selection is that by the time you looked at the top 100, most of the specialists were weeded out, and it was all generalists. So it was primary care physicians and or emergency physicians. By the time you got to the top 60, there was maybe 1 specialist and the rest were generalists. And to me, that makes sense, because if you want to send humans to the moon or Mars, you really want a Swiss Army knife of a physician. You want someone who can do preventative and primary care, but you can also want someone who knows how to intubate and do a central line, right? So that's my personal opinion, and that also seems to be what I extrapolated from the previous CSA selection.
Thanks. Would that, when you say generalists, would that include general surgeons as well? Because I would think that would be a good skill set to be on a space station, because any like the best a medical medicine doctor is a phone call away, but the best surgeon is like a long trip away, right?
Kind of, sort of. So we're looking more and more at space surgery going forwards. There's been interest over the past decades. There have been the famous Canadian experiment, Dr. Andy Kirkpatrick, he's general surgeon out of UOC. He did a liver packing experiment on parabolic flight in the Vomit Comet. There is not a space OR, but we're looking at that. There's an ASMA. So ASMA is the Aerospace Medical Association. There's a space surgery group. So we're looking at, because we need to develop those capabilities on Mars and figure out what is it like to do laparoscopic surgery in 1/3 gravity. So now we're seriously thinking of those. There have been some animal experiments with space surgery. So STS-95, Dr. J.C. Bucky, he was a physician, as well as Dave Williams, Canadian physician. They did some surgery experiments. They took neonatal mice. They did spinal surgery. They did muscle biopsies. I once had the chance to ask them about it and asked him what it was like. He said it wasn't that different. So then what we know about blood in 0G is that it's quite cohesive. So at least it sticks together. It's not messy. If blood floats off in 0G, you simply take the gauze and wick it away. The modifications are, so your instruments don't float everywhere, is you have Velcro and you can Velcro those instruments down. So there has been precedent for surgery in space, but now we're starting to develop and look into those capabilities more. There's a lot of great literature out there. And then there's some really fun questions to ask about, well, how far do we take this? Do we perform prophylactic appendectomies on anyone going to Mars and beyond? So we don't have to worry about appendicitis in space. And the precedent for that is based on Via las Estrellas on Earth. That's a Chilean settlement on Antarctica. And so basically anyone over age 6 has to get their appendix out to live there, because definitive care is like something like 600 either miles or kilometers away. So there are a lot of considerations, but if you're interested, are you a medical student, Nolan?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so if you're interested, anyone who's interested, go be part of ASMA and then ask to join the space surgery group. It's a great group. I'm part of it as well.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Let's see what I've missed in the chat. Is dynamic exercise helpful for astronaut to dynamic? Do you mean, what do you mean, Abdul? You can either unmute or add some more clarification. So basically what we want with the current exercise regimens is we want to maintain muscle mass and prevent bone density loss, which is why the current program consists of 1 hour of aerobic as well as weight bear, and then 1 to 1.5 hours of resistive exercise. So those are the two major considerations. And now there's next generation devices. I was lucky enough to be part of the European Space Agency's space medicine course last week, and they talked about a new device called the Omni, which can replicate all manner of squats and dips and lifts and stuff with a single device. I hope I answered that adequately. All right, I know we're over time, but any questions, comments, concerns? Like I said, this is my jam. I love this stuff. So happy to answer any questions.
Sorry, what was that group you told me earlier, like asthma or something like that?
Yeah, I'll type it in the chat.
Awesome, thanks.
And I think it's on the slides at the resources at the end. Space surgery.
And thank you for your talk. It was really cool.
I like to think so. Space medicine's never boring. So, yeah, there's lots of precedent. There's Concordia Research Station on Earth. So that's run by the European Space Agency. They do send crews for a year down at a time. Canada is considered a ESA cooperating ESA cooperating partner state. So they ask for a doctor from one of those states to go down for a year at a time. So if you're ever interested to apply as a physician to go to Antarctica for 12 to 14 months, there's an opportunity for that. Are we considering artificial reproduction? Well, so even with artificial reproduction, so even if you artificially inseminate, you know, there's still, so the issues with reproduction and gravity and in altered gravity, it's everything from gamete production to, is there theoretical increased risk of ectopic pregnancy because gravity isn't having the embryo implanted in the uterus? Do we know that? We don't. What about what will blastocyst formation and evolution occur normally? What does the in utero development look like? We know that there's some animal studies. We know that, for example, in wasps, there's an increased rate of death in the offspring in flown male wasps. We know that in rats in development at 3 months, there's increased neurodegenerative changes, neuromotor degeneration, but that's a transient effect. So the short answer is further study is needed. We don't have enough data as to what successful reproduction looks like. Artificial wombs, same thing. Like even if you had a womb, like unless you're planning on rotating it like a centrifuge, you're still not mitigating the gravity. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, great session.
Perfect. Yeah, email me questions either at my Gmail or UAlberta address. And then next class, be prepared to come work. It'll be a workshop taking on what you've learned about innovation and constraints and coming up with your own innovation. Thank you, Kim, for having me yet again. This has been awesome. I always love being in this course. And thank you all for attending and staying late. Have a great day.